"Don't, someone might see," she whispered, and the whisper seemed to ripple across the wide, open afternoon like a stone skimming a pond, small but capable of traveling farther than anyone intended. Her fingers tightening around the coarse denim of his sleeve as if the cloth itself were a lifeline, the only thing anchoring her to the moment before it tipped into something irreversible, and the rancher felt the tug not just in his arm, but in his chest, a pull made of habit and caution, and all the lessons a small town drills into a person before they're old enough to understand why. Lessons about keeping things quiet, about choosing the back way instead of the front, about how eyes linger and mouths talk and stories grow legs of their own. And for a breath he stood still with the sun bright on his hat brim and the wind sliding over the range in long, dry sighs, the smell of hay and dust and iron from the hitching posts mixing with the sharper scent of the feed store down the road. The afternoon stretched thin and open, nowhere to hide even if he wanted to, and he did want to, at least the part of him that remembered being a boy trailing behind his father, hearing names spoken softly at supper, and seeing those same names stiffen into smiles on Sunday morning, learning early how a town could be both home and witness, both shelter and judge. And he knew the rhythm of this place so well he could feel it humming under his boots, knew who would be watching without looking, and who would look without caring, knew how fast a glance could become a rumor and a rumor a verdict, and still he didn't pull away, didn't step back into the thin slice of shade cast by the porch, didn't loosen his fingers from hers, because there was another rhythm beating louder now, steady and stubborn. Rhythm of a choice made long before this moment, and only now demanding to be lived out loud. And he turned his head slightly, enough to meet her eyes, which were wide with that mix of fear and hope that always comes just before a door opens, and he saw in them the weeks of walking at dusk instead of noon, the careful distances kept in public, the way she'd laughed too quickly whenever someone passed, the way he'd learned to read the town's mood, the way he read the sky for weather, always watching for a change, always ready to move, and he felt a strange calm settle over him, not the calm of safety but the calm of clarity, the kind that arrives when the argument inside finally ends, when the mind stops circling and lands, and he lifted his chin and let his gaze sweep the road, the main street laid out like a stage with its familiar props, the post office with its peeling paint, general store's open door breathing out the cool dark, the hitching rail lined with patient horses flicking their tails, the windows where lace curtains shifted as if stirred by the breeze, though he knew better. And he felt the town's attention like heat on his skin, not yet focused, not yet sharp. But they're all the same, waiting, and he thought of his land beyond the rise, the long fences mended and remended, the calves born in storms and sunshine, the work that never asked who was watching and never waited for approval, work that simply needed doing, and the thought steadied him further. Because this felt like that, like a fence post that had to be set straight even if the ground was hard and the sun unforgiving, and he squeezed her hand, not to rush her but to let her feel the decision settle into his bones, and when he stepped forward it wasn't dramatic or defiant, just a single, honest step into the open, boots scuffing dust, the sound loud in his own ears, and the world didn't end, the sky didn't fall, the town didn't erupt, not yet. But something shifted all the same, like the first crack of thunder on a hot day, and as he moved he felt her hesitation tug again, a tremor passing through her fingers, and he slowed, matching her pace, because this wasn't about dragging anyone into the light. It was about standing there himself and letting her choose it too, and he remembered the first time he'd noticed how the town looked at her, the way curiosity sharpened into speculation, the way kindness sometimes curdled into something else, and he remembered his own silence then, how easy it had been to let the current carry him, to keep his head down and his life tidy, and the memory stung but didn't stop him. It only added weight to the step, made it mean more, and he felt eyes now, definite and curious, felt the pause in the street's easy flow as people sensed a story forming before it had words, and he breathed in, slow and deep, the way he did before opening a stubborn gate, and kept walking, his hands still wrapped around hers, open and visible, not hidden in a pocket or tucked behind his back, and the sun caught on her hair and turned it bright, impossible to miss, and someone coughed, someone else laughed a little too loud, and the normal sounds of the afternoon, boots on boards, a door creaking, a horse stamping, took on a brittle edge, as if they were listening too, and he thought of how many times he'd crossed this street alone, just another man among men, and how different it felt now with every step counted, measured, weighed, and he felt a flicker of anger then, not at her fear but at the town's quiet claim on him, the unspoken rule that said visibility was permission, that said some truths belonged only in the margins, and the anger surprised him with its steadiness, because it wasn't hot or wild, it was clear, and clarity is hard to argue with, and he realized he wasn't doing this to provoke anyone, wasn't doing it to make a point or invite a fight. He was doing it because shrinking had started to feel heavier than standing, because the cost of hiding had finally outweighed the risk of being seen, and that realization loosened something in his chest, made the air easier to draw, and he glanced down at their joined hands again, the simple fact of it grounding him, and he felt her grip shift, still tight but no longer pulling back, and he took that as permission enough, and the wind lifted, carrying dust and the distant low of cattle, and for a moment the town seemed very small against the breadth of the land, its judgments thin and fragile, and he thought, not for the first time, that places like this only stay alive because someone is always willing to do the ordinary brave thing in plain sight, to walk where everyone can see and refuse to pretend it isn't happening. And as they reached the center of the street, he felt the attention sharpen, felt the unspoken question ripple outward, and he knew there would be consequences, there always were, but he also knew this moment would stand no matter what came after, fixed and unchangeable, a marker set in the ground, and he straightened his shoulders, not in defiance but in acceptance, and let the town look its fill, because for the first time he wasn't measuring himself by its gaze. He was measuring the truth by how it felt to hold it in the open, and it felt solid, it felt right, and as the afternoon stretched on and the light shifted, that feeling stayed, steady as a fence line running true across open land, unbroken, and finally, unmistakably, seen. By sundown, the town had begun to lose its mind in the quiet, particular way that small places do, not with shouting at first, but with a tightening, a collective drawing in of breath that made the air feel thinner even as the heat finally bled out of the day, and the rancher could feel it as he stood near the general store steps, the way the light slanted low and gold and made every familiar surface look newly exposed, as if the town itself were being examined under a different angle, and people gathered without admitting they were gathering, drifting closer in ones and twos, pausing longer than necessary, inventing reasons to linger, because something unresolved hung between them now, and unresolved things demand witnesses, and the first words that cut through the low murmur were sharp and careless, thrown like stones to see what would break. Someone saying it wasn't proper, someone else saying they'd never seen the like, voices overlapping and contradicting, each one testing the ground, and the rancher listened without reacting at first, his hands loose at his sides, his posture easy but alert, because this was the part he'd known would come, the moment when seeing turned into judgment and judgment into pressure, and he let himself feel the weight of it without flinching, the way he did when a storm pressed low over the range, and there was nothing to do but ride it out. And he noticed how the words landed differently depending on who spoke them, how some carried the brittle edge of fear dressed up as tradition, and others carried a rough curiosity that could still turn either way, and he catalogued it all without meaning to, the way a man who has lived among the same people all his life can hear entire histories in a single phrase. And he saw Mrs. Calder retrieve her basket at last, her movements stiff, her mouth set in a line that suggested she was already rehearsing how she'd tell this later, and he saw the boys break their frozen argument and drift closer, eyes wide, absorbing the lesson that was unfolding in real time, and he felt a flash of anger then, not hot but deep, at the idea that this moment would become a warning to them, a lesson about limits rather than honesty, and the anger rooted him further, made him more determined to stand where he was and not retreat into apology, and the murmurs swelled and broke against one another, someone muttering that it would bring trouble, someone else saying trouble was already here if people couldn't mind their own business, and the sheriff shifted his weight on the porch, watching the balance of the crowd rather than the rancher himself, because his job now was less about law than about temperature, and the rancher understood that too, understood how authority in a small town often functioned as a weather vane, responding to pressure rather than creating it, and he waited, because waiting was sometimes the only way to let things surface fully, and as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched, the town's restraint thinned, the careful politeness that usually governed disagreements giving way to sharper edges, and someone laughed outright now, a scoffing sound meant to dismiss, and someone else snapped back, and the sound of it cut through him, not because it hurt but because it clarified that silence was no longer neutral, that standing without speaking had done its work and now demanded a next step, and he felt her presence beside him again, steady and quiet, and he took a breath that seemed to draw the whole scene into his chest, the faces, words, the history, and when he stepped up onto the store's low steps it wasn't dramatic so much as inevitable, a shift in elevation that gave his voice somewhere to land, and the movement itself stilled the crowd more effectively than any shout could have, because people recognized that posture. The posture of someone about to speak not in defense but in declaration, and the rancher waited another heartbeat, long enough for the last murmurs to fade, long enough for the town to feel the shape of the silence, and when he spoke his voice surprised even him with its calm, with the way it carried without strain, not loud but clear, and he didn't address anyone in particular at first, because this wasn't a conversation so much as a statement of fact, and he said that he knew what people were thinking, knew what they'd been taught to expect and what they'd been taught to fear, and he said it without accusation because accusation would only harden positions, and he saw that some faces tightened anyway because recognition can feel like exposure, and he continued, explaining not with reasons so much as with truth, that he wasn't asking anyone to agree, wasn't asking permission or approval, and the words settled into the crowd with a dull thud because they cut against the unspoken contract of the place, the idea that the town's consent was required for anything visible, and he could feel the ripple of that, the way people shifted, some bristling, some leaning in, and he spoke then about daylight in whispers, about how the town prided itself on honesty and hard work and straight talk, and how hiding something honest didn't make it less real, it only made it heavier, and he watched as that landed, saw the way some eyes flickered with something like shame and others with defiance, and he didn't push further than that, because he knew better than to overwork a point, knew that in a place like this too many words could drown out the few that mattered, and he finished by saying simply that he would not pretend anymore, that this was his life and his choice, and that he would stand by it in the open, and the quiet that followed was not empty but charged, thick with unspoken responses, and for a long moment no one moved, no one spoke, and the rancher felt the full weight of the town's gaze settle on him like a physical thing, and he stood there and took it, letting it pass through him rather than lodge, and he felt a strange peace in that, the peace that comes from having aligned action and belief so completely that there is nothing left to defend, and then the reactions began to break loose in earnest, voices rising, overlapping, someone accusing him of provoking trouble, someone else accusing the accuser of meddling, words like tradition and decency and courage thrown back and forth like tools and weapons, and the sheriff stepped forward at last, not to stop him but to slow the crowd, his presence a reminder of boundaries even as those boundaries shifted, and the rancher listened as his neighbors argued about him as if he weren't there, a sensation both surreal and clarifying, because it stripped the discussion down to its essentials, revealing that this was never really about him alone. It was about the town's story of itself, and whether that story could stretch without tearing, and he saw in some faces the fear of that stretch, the worry that allowing one visible difference would unravel everything, and in others he saw a cautious curiosity, a recognition that perhaps the town was stronger than it believed, and the sun slipped fully below the horizon then, the light draining from the street and leaving behind the cooler blue of evening, and lamps flickered on one by one, throwing uneven pools of light that broke the crowd into clusters, and with the darkness came a subtle shift, a loosening, as if night itself granted permission for complexity, and the arguments softened into conversations, still intense but less sharp, and people began to peel away, drawn back to suppers and chores and the familiar comfort of their own kitchens, carrying the moment with them like a stone in a pocket. And the rancher stepped down from the store steps at last, his legs feeling the delayed tremor of what he'd done, and he felt her hand find his again, steady and warm, and that simple contact grounded him more than any words could have. And as they walked away from the center of town, the voices followed them for a while, then faded, replaced by the ordinary sounds of evening, doors closing, dishes clinking, a radio somewhere humming low, and he knew the night would be full of talk, that the story would spread and morph and harden in places, soften in others, and he accepted that too, because stories were the town's currency, and this one, at least, had begun in truth. And as they reached the edge of the street and the buildings thinned, he felt a deep, settling fatigue, the kind that follows real work, and beneath it a quiet certainty, because whatever the town decided, whatever lines were drawn or redrawn, this moment had already done its work. It had cracked something open, and cracks let light in whether people wanted them to or not. And he walked on into the deepening evening with that knowledge steady in him, knowing that the loss of the town's easy comfort was the price of gaining something rarer and more durable, a life lived without bending away from itself, and that knowledge, once claimed, could not be taken back. It began with a sound so small it might have been missed if the street hadn't already been holding its breath, a sharp intake of air from somewhere near the feed barrels, a gasp that cut through the afternoon like a pin through cloth, and then another sound answered it, the soft thud of a basket hitting dirt as misses. Calder's fingers loosened without her noticing, apples rolling free and catching the light as they bumped against one another, and that was all it took for the town to wake fully to what was happening, because small places don't need announcements, they need only a cue, a ripple that told everyone else where to look, and heads turned in a way that was almost practiced, almost graceful, the way sunflowers track the sun, and the rancher felt it then, the precise moment when curiosity sharpened into attention, when the street stopped being a collection of errands and became an audience, and he kept walking anyway, his boots finding their rhythm on the packed earth, her steps half a beat behind his at first before settling into time, and he could feel her awareness flaring, the way her shoulders tensed and then eased, tensed and eased again, as if she were bracing for impact that kept not quite arriving, and he wondered, briefly and with a pang, how many times she'd been looked at this way before without him beside her, how many times the attention had felt like a weight she carried alone, and the thought steadied his grip, not tightening it but making it certain, and around them the town assembled itself piece by piece. Mr. Holly's pausing mid-sentence on the general store steps, his mouth still shaped around a word he didn't finish, two boys freezing in the middle of an argument, one with his finger raised, accusation suspended, the sheriff straightening on the porch as if a bell had rung somewhere only he could hear, his hand hovering near his badge not in threat but habit, because in a town like this authority often mistook surprise for disorder, and the rancher registered all of it without breaking stride, his awareness widening the way it did on horseback when a storm threatened, taking in the whole horizon at once, and he felt the murmur start then, low and uncertain, a sound without words yet, just the vibration of many minds reaching for the same explanation, and it rolled over them like distant thunder, not loud enough to be named but loud enough to be felt, and someone laughed, a short, nervous sound that didn't quite land, and someone else shushed them, and the normal afternoon noises rearranged themselves around this new center, doors opening more slowly, footsteps pausing, the creak of a sign swinging in the breeze suddenly too loud, and he thought of how often he'd stood in this very street watching other people become stories, how he'd felt the same pull of interest and judgment and relief that it wasn't him this time, and the memory didn't shame him so much as it clarified something, because now he understood how thin that relief always was, how easily it shifted. And he felt a flicker of something like responsibility then, not just to her but to the moment itself, to carry it cleanly without flinching, and he lifted his gaze and met the eyes that met his, not all of them, but enough to make it clear he wasn't passing through, wasn't unaware, wasn't ashamed, and the effect was immediate and subtle, like a change in weather pressure, because people weren't used to being looked back at when they were in the act of looking, weren't used to having their curiosity acknowledged, and some eyes slid away while others hardened, and a few, to his surprise, softened, and he felt the street's hum change pitch, the uncertainty tipping toward opinion, and he heard his name then, spoken quietly but distinctly, carried on the breeze from someone who thought quiet meant private, and it struck him how odd it was to hear it said like that, not as a greeting or a call, but as a marker, a label being attached to a moment, and he almost smiled at the familiarity of it, because names had always traveled faster than truths here, and he kept walking, crossing the invisible line at the center of town where the road widened and everything felt more exposed, and the sun shifted just enough to catch on the windows, throwing back bright fragments of reflection that made it hard to see faces clearly. And he was grateful for that, grateful for the brief anonymity of glare. And beside him she drew a steadier breath, and he felt her fingers adjust in his, not loosening but finding a more natural hold, and he took that as another small victory, unannounced but real, and the murmurs gained words now, distinct enough to pick out pieces, a question here, a judgment there, the soft cluck of disapproval that needed no explanation, the sharper edge of interest that pretended to be concern, and he recognized the patterns, the way stories formed like trails through tall grass, following paths worn by older stories, and he knew what would come next if someone didn't interrupt it, the slow accumulation of certainty without evidence, and he felt an impulse to speak then, to say something simple and clear that would either settle the matter or ignite it. But he held back, because sometimes the bravest thing wasn't to announce but to persist, to let the sight itself do the work words would only complicate, and he remembered his father again. Remembered the way he'd once walked into town after a bad season, shoulders squared not in pride but in resolve, letting people see the strain and not explaining it away, and how that had changed the way the town spoke of him afterward, not kinder, perhaps, but more honest, and the rancher drew on that memory now, letting it steady his pace, and he felt the sheriff's gaze settle on him fully, a weight he knew well, and he met it briefly, not challenging, not submissive, just present, and the sheriff's hand dropped from his badge, the moment passing without comment, and that small gesture sent another ripple through the onlookers, because authorities' cues mattered here, and he felt the tension ease by a degree, not gone but redistributed. And as they passed the general store, the door creaked wider. Mr. Polly stepping down onto the boardwalk, his expression caught between surprise and calculation, and the rancher knew that look too, the look of someone already weighing how this would play at supper tables and Sunday gatherings, and he felt a flash of irritation at that, not hot enough to burn, but sharp enough to focus, and he straightened again, his shoulders aligning with the line of the street, and he realized with a start that he was no longer thinking about being seen. He was thinking about being accurate, about matching his outer posture to the inner decision he'd already made, and that alignment felt good, felt right in a way that didn't depend on approval, and the murmurs rose again as someone recognized her, said her name this time, and that did something to the crowd, made it more specific, because names always did, and he felt her flinch then, just a fraction, and he slowed half a step without stopping, letting her catch up, and he leaned slightly toward her, not whispering but letting his presence speak, and she matched his pace again, her chin lifting a touch, and he felt a quiet surge of pride then, not possessive but protective, the kind that comes from witnessing someone choose courage in real time, and the street seemed narrower now, the buildings leaning in as if to hear better, and he heard the bell clang somewhere, sharp and unnecessary, the sound scattering birds from a nearby fence, and he thought of how bells were meant to call people together to announce things that mattered, and he almost laughed at the coincidence, because that was exactly what was happening, whether anyone wanted it or not. And the town's collective mind tipped further, curiosity giving way to reaction, and he saw it on faces. The way eyebrows drew together, the way mouths tightened or curved, and he recognized that no single reaction would define this moment, that it would be the accumulation that mattered, the slow settling of opinion over days and weeks. But this first sight would be the seed, and he took a quiet satisfaction in that, knowing that whatever grew from it would be rooted in something true and visible, not whispered and distorted. And as they reached the far side of the street, he felt the energy crest, felt the sense that something was about to happen, someone was about to speak or step forward, and he prepared himself for that, his body attuning the way it did before a gate swung or a horse spooked, ready but not tense, and for a heartbeat it seemed as if the town itself hesitated, uncertain how to proceed now that the unspoken had been spoken by action alone. And then someone cleared their throat, loud and deliberate, and another voice answered with a comment that tried to sound casual and failed, and the spell broke just enough for movement to resume, people shifting their weight, picking up baskets, resuming arguments, though none of it quite returned to normal, because the center had moved. And he felt the eyes linger even as bodies turned away, and he knew the looks would follow them for a while yet, down the road and into memory, and he accepted that because acceptance didn't mean agreement. It meant understanding the shape of what he'd chosen, and as they walked on, he felt a strange lightness join the weight, a sense that whatever came next would come honestly, without the drag of secrecy, and he glanced at her again and saw that her breathing had evened, that the fear had not vanished but had been joined by something else, something steadier, and he felt a quiet gratitude for that, for the way courage could be shared, passed back and forth like a tool, and behind them the town buzzed and argued and rearranged itself around this new fact, and ahead of them the road stretched open, sunlit and ordinary, and the rancher kept walking, step after deliberate step, letting the moment complete itself not with a speech or a showdown, but with the simple, undeniable fact of having crossed the street together in full view, and knowing, with a certainty that settled deep and stayed, that there was no walking it back now, and no need to. Night cooled the street in stages, not all at once but gradually, like a hand easing pressure from a bruise, and the rancher felt the change as he and she walked away from the thinning clusters of light and argument, the air carrying a dampness that hadn't been there at noon, the heat of the day finally surrendering to the quiet authority of evening, and behind them the town settled into itself with the uneasy calm that follows an upheaval no one has fully agreed to name. Doors closing more firmly than usual, windows glowing with lamplight and silhouettes that leaned together, already shaping the story into something that would fit their kitchens and convictions, and the rancher didn't hurry, didn't try to outrun what had been set in motion, because he knew better than to think distance could undo visibility, and he felt the road under his boots change texture as they moved. Beyond the center, the packed dirt giving way to the familiar gravel that marked the edge of town, and with each step the noise receded, replaced by the softer sounds he trusted more, the chirr of insects beginning their nightly work, the low rustle of wind through dry grass, the distant, comforting sound of cattle shifting in their pens, and he drew a deeper breath than he had all afternoon, the kind that fills the chest fully and lingers, and beside him she matched his pace without effort now, her hand still in his, her presence no longer tense but thoughtful, and he sensed in her the same mixture he felt himself, a fatigue threaded with relief, a vulnerability edged with resolve, and they walked in silence for a while, because silence was finally safe again, not the tight, fearful quiet of hiding but the open kind that allows thoughts to settle where they belong. And the rancher found his mind drifting through the day in fragments, not replaying it so much as measuring it, testing how it felt now that it was done, and he was surprised to find that the sharpest moments no longer stung, that even the harder words spoken by neighbors had lost their bite, because the center of gravity had shifted, the decision no longer hanging in the air but anchored, and he felt gratitude then, unexpected and broad, for the land that waited for them beyond the last row of houses, for the way the road curved towards something known and solid, and as they reached the place where town gave way to open fields, he paused, not because he needed to, but because the moment asked for it, and he looked back once, taking in the line of lights and dark shapes, the familiar outline of buildings that had shaped his life, and he didn't feel anger or triumph, only a quiet acknowledgement. An understanding that places like people carry contradictions, that love and harm can coexist without canceling each other, and he turned forward again, the choice reaffirmed without ceremony, and they continued on, the sky above them deepening into a clear, star-pricked expanse that seemed to widen with every step, and the first stars appeared sharp and unapologetic, not hiding their brightness for anyone, and he smiled faintly at that, the symbolism not lost on him even as he resisted turning it into something precious or sentimental, because this wasn't about symbols, it was about living, about waking up tomorrow and doing the work that needed doing with the same steadiness he always had. And he knew tomorrow would bring consequences, small and large, averted gazes and unexpected kindnesses, a tightening of some relationships and a surprising loosening of others, and he accepted that future without rehearsing it, trusting that the same clarity that had carried him through today would carry him through what came next. And as they walked, the road narrowed and the ground sloped gently, and he felt the familiar pull of home, the way his body recognized the land before his eyes fully did, and she spoke then, softly, not to break the silence but to join it, saying his name with a tone that held both question and gratitude, and he answered just as simply, letting his response rest in the space between them without embellishment, and they shared a quiet smile, the kind that doesn't need witnesses, and farther back in town the arguments had mostly given way to speculation, to the slow, grinding work of assimilation that small places do when confronted with something new, and the rancher knew that by morning the sharpest edges would be dulled, not erased, but worn smoother by repetition and routine, and he also knew that something essential had shifted, that the town would never quite be able to pretend it hadn't seen what it had seen, that the memory of daylight courage would linger even in those who resisted it, and that knowledge settled into him like a well-set fence post, deep and stable, and when they reached the gate he stopped again to open it, the familiar creak sounding louder in the quiet night, and he held it as she passed through, their roles unspoken and natural, and as he closed it behind them he felt the day finally end, not with a bang but with a sense of completion, and they walked the last stretch toward the house, the windows dark and waiting, the porch steps worn smooth by years of use, and he imagined tomorrow morning's light touching the same boards, the same door, and the thought brought not dread but a steady readiness, and inside the house the air was cool and still, holding the faint scent of wood and dust and the comfort of things that endure, and he lit a lamp, its glow filling the room gently, and they stood there for a moment, looking at one another, seeing reflected back the courage and cost of the day, and he felt a deep affection then, not only for her but for the version of himself he had allowed into the open, and as they moved through the quiet routines of evening, setting aside boots, washing hands, the ordinariness of it all felt like a gift, a reminder that life continues even after moments that feel momentous, and outside the night wrapped the land in calm, the town's lights distant and subdued, and somewhere a coyote called, answered by another farther off, the sound carrying across the open space without apology or fear of being heard, and the rancher listened to it and felt a final, settling certainty that whatever the town thought it had lost that day, it had also been given something, a chance to see itself more clearly, and that he, too, had gained something he would not trade back, a life aligned with itself, lived not in the margins but in the open. And as he blew out the lamp and the room fell into darkness, the darkness felt gentle chosen, no longer a place to hide but simply the natural close of a long day, and he lay down knowing that morning would come, as it always did, and that when it did he would meet it without flinching, fully seen, it fully, finally, at home.